All right, welcome back. So the title of this mini lecture is going to be Brazil in World War II. There's a lot to know and there's a lot to learn about this topic and especially around World War II in general. So let's get into it. First off, so if we are studying Latin American history in the U.S., it's good for us to know and understand and acknowledge that we don't often in this country acknowledge as much as we should the support that Latin America generally gave to the Allied effort during the Second World War. That support was common and constant, and it was present from the first day of American entry into the war. So, an example of that would be on December 7, 1941, Pearl Harbor was attacked by Japanese forces, and that night, or that day, later that day, the First Lady's radio show, Eleanor Roosevelt, she typically had a radio show, there was sponsorship there from something called the Pan American Coffee Bureau, and not only, of course, were they giving their normal sponsorship, but they were stating, of course, that the nations of the Pan American Coffee Bureau as well also support the Americans, and that the Americas sort of stand together, I think is the quote from that particular radio show. So again, early efforts, early support, common and constant. It's a big part of the understanding of the Americas and that kind of relationship there. All right, number two. So Brazil, by 1942, would strongly support American efforts in the war. And this support would lead to a declaration of war on the part of the Brazilian government by the end of that year. So, August 1942, Brazil declares war against the Axis powers. Part of this is brought on by the transformation of the relationship with the United States. There's a joint defense commission that's created. The United States is going to put bases in Brazil. And in response to much of this, the Germans are going to start sinking Brazilian ships. And so needing to defend Brazilian shipping and support the Allied effort, the Brazilian government is going to declare war, and they're going to get involved in World War II. Third, Brazil contributes a division of soldiers who fought with distinction throughout the war. So once World War II gets going and the Brazilians enter the war, you're going to see soldiers deployed primarily to Italy, in support of the Allied efforts there. Now, the Brazilian division was attached to the United States' 5th Division. Generally, these guys are going to wear American uniforms, but they're going to have Brazilian markings and patches and everything else. They're going to be referred to as the Smoking Cobras as a part of something called the Brazilian Expeditionary Force. Now, Allied efforts in Italy began in 1943. By early summer and fall, Rome would be captured in June of 1944. But the efforts on the part of the Allies against Italy and the German forces in Italy too would last throughout the entirety of the war. So the Brazilians are going to play a role in that with some distinction. Fourthly, Navy connections matter, especially in World War II. The Brazilian Navy is important in something called the Battle of the Atlantic. All right, they matter in the Battle of the Atlantic. The United States' efforts during World War II, of course, involve ships and troops and this kind of thing, but the arsenal of democracy, this idea of supplying the world and the Allies with much of what they would need, is really going to be one of the big things for the Americans to come out of the war. Well, America doesn't grow everything itself. It gets a lot of it from its neighbors. And so much of this stuff is going to come from Brazil. Now, the Brazilian government will have, of course, contracts with the Americans to purchase Navy ships and this kind of thing. And the Battle of the Atlantic, this naval war against German forces across the Atlantic, again, is something that the Brazilians are going to be involved in. Generally, the way the timeline of the Battle of the Atlantic usually goes is that 1940 is a really successful period for the Germans where they're sinking a lot of shipping. 1941, that declines because the British Navy takes over a lot of this and does really well. 1942, the Americans get more fully involved and they're not really coordinating well with all their allies, so the Germans are more successful. 1943, 44, 45, increases in production happen, and you have better coordination from the Allies, from the Brazilians and the Americans and the British and everybody else, and so the Battle of the Atlantic is eventually won. And it's really, really important for the arsenal of democracy. Fifth point, memories of the war and legacies of service mattered for Brazilians after the war was over, right? This question of what had they been fighting for, what is the new world going to look like? This is all a big part of the post-war political and cultural discussions in Brazil. All right, thanks so much.